Hi everyone, in this video I will be discussing the results section of a paper. So for the results section, you will have everything in APA format. Your headings, tables, figures, and the statistics that you will be reporting should all be in APA format. And part of what this means is that all your statistical terms will be in italics. So for instance, your mean represented by capital M, your standard deviation represented by capital SD, your p-value, your R, all statistical terms will be italicized in your write-up. What this also means is that for your p-values, unless they are less than 0.001, you should be reporting the exact value. So if you have a p-value of, say, 0.03, you will write p equals 0.03. But if you have a p-value less than 0.001, then you can say p less than 0.001. Another thing to note is that between the less than and equal sign, you should have a space before and after them. So we see p space less than space 0.001, and we also see here that before and after the equal sign is a space. Some other things to note is that in the results section, you will be using past tense, so no present or future tense. Everything should be in past tense. This is also where you will be describing your data analyses and your findings. So you won't really be explaining your opinion in this section. That's what the discussion section will be for. But here you're just being factual. You're stating what you did and what the results of that analysis is. And so here you're going to be succinct, objective, and concise. So how does one go about writing a results section? Well, there are a couple of things you need to include. So firstly, you need to include the descriptive statistics for your independent variable, your dependent variable, and your subscales. You also need to describe and include your inferential statistics. So did you do a t-test? Did you do a regression, an ANOVA? You need to state what you did for your readers. You'll also have to write everything out, so you'll have a statistical write-up of your inferential statistics, and these should include effect sizes because we're doing this in APA format. For your effect size, this is basically how big your treatment effect is, but also like the percent of variance in the variables that can be explained by that relationship. Lastly, once you report your statistics, you also need to connect them back to your hypothesis. Do these results support your hypothesis? Do they provide evidence for it? Or do they not provide evidence for it? And then also, if you have any tables or figures in your paper, then you will refer to them in your results section. So you'll say, as seen in figure 1, or as described in table 1, so on and so forth. So here are some examples of what reporting descriptive and inferential statistics in the results section look like. So for the descriptive statistics, our first example reads, the average score on the happiness scale was 87, parentheses, standard deviation equals 15. So we report our mean and our standard deviation. The mean doesn't always have to be in parentheses, so here we reported the mean as a part of the sentence and then had the standard deviation come right after it. Another way to report the mean and standard deviation is having them both in parentheses. So here we see we have the group women, and then after them we have parentheses describing the mean and standard deviation for each. Notice that for all of these we have no more than 2 decimal places, and that our statistical terms, so here mean and standard deviation, are all in italics. So for an example of what reporting the type of test you used is, the first one reads, an independent samples t-test was conducted to determine differences in happiness levels between women and men. So right away we state that we're doing an independent samples t-test and then state what that test is being used for. Our next example reads, a correlation was conducted to determine the association between age and happiness level. So again, we report the type of test we're doing right away, and then what that test is being used for. So on this slide, we're going to talk about how to report your statistical tests in APA format. Generally speaking, they will all have somewhat the same pattern. You'll start with the test abbreviation, followed by your degrees of freedom in parentheses, that equaling your test value. Then you'll have your p-value, followed by your effect size. So for t-tests, we see here that it's at the end of the sentence. We see that the t-test is represented by this italicized t. We have our degrees of freedom in the parentheses equal to our test statistic, comma, our p-value, and then afterwards our effect size, which is equal to 0.50. And again, notice that we're only using 2 decimal places here, except for when p is less than 0.001. For correlation, it's somewhat similar, but with small changes. So correlation is represented by this italicized R. We still have our degrees of freedom in parentheses, have that equal to our test value. We have our p-value equals to 0.01. But then here, instead of our effect size, we actually have R squared, which is this test value squared. So we have R squared equals to 0.24. Next, for our regression, we see that this example reads, hopefulness and anxiety were positively associated with greater feelings of ambivalence about the future, comma. And so for regressions, these are represented with the test abbreviation capital F. And then we have our degrees of freedom in parentheses equal to our test statistic, comma, our p-value, and comma, our capital R squared. For our ANCOVA example, it reads, after adjusting for years of physical activity, there was a statistically significant difference between basketball players and footballers on levels of back pain. So the ANCOVA is also represented by a capital F, but the difference between that and the multiple regression is that the ANCOVA actually has 2 different degrees of freedom. So we'll have the capital F and then in parentheses our first degrees of freedom, comma, the second one. Have that equal to our test statistic, comma, our p-value, and then our partial eta squared for our effect size. And that's equal to 0.84. So we see all of them kind of have a similar format in that they're all reported at the end of the sentence. We have our test abbreviation, degrees of freedom, p-value. Some have the effect size, and then some have R squared. All right, so lastly, examples on how to connect this to your hypothesis. So you've done your analyses, and now you need to connect them to what your hypothesis is. So our first example reads, our results support our hypothesis that women have higher happiness levels compared to men. And our second example reads, our results support our hypothesis that age is positively correlated with happiness level. So here we see that after reporting the statistic, they state whether or not it supported their hypothesis. If it did not support their hypothesis, then they would also have to say, our results did not support our hypothesis, that so on and so forth. All right, so some final notes on APA format. Remember that if a p-value is greater than 0.05, it's referred to as non-significant, not insignificant. So recall that in order for a statistical test to support our hypothesis, p has to be less than 0.05. But if it's greater than 0.05, then we will say that it is non-significant. Also, you should remember to briefly translate the meaning of the numbers into words. You're not discussing the numbers, but you're just translating them so people understand what these numbers are supposed to represent and what they should mean. And also be sure to use APA format for tables and figures. Never directly copy them from SPSS because, again, SPSS does not automatically put them into APA format.